Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to read two extracts from the novel. And Mother of All Pigs has a pig. So we'll start with the starring character. From the moment Abu Zatar showed him the pig, Hussein knew it was not going to be an easy road to riches. He had not really thought any further than the first litter and assumed the piglets would be fattened up for a one-off bonanza sale. Then the business would end. He had not reckoned on the pigs' natural behavior. No sooner were the young boars weaned, they acquired the mounting reflex. First they tried their mother, then each other, and finally turned their attention to their own sisters. Hussein watched them and began to wonder whether there might be more to the project than he thought. He knew castration was the best way to ensure that the boars fattened up properly, but he decided to spare 2 of them from the knife. He left them with their mother and 5 of their sisters and moved the other 13 piglets into different pens. The males mated with an uninhibited libidinous indulgence, reveling in their 13-minute orgasms. Fascinated, Hussein timed them on a fancy Taiwanese stopwatch, accurate to 1/10 of a second, borrowed from the marvelous Emporium. The experiment paid off. At the end of the 5th month, the mother and 3 of her daughters were pregnant. The rest of the litter was ready for market, but Hussein made a peculiar discovery. He did not have the heart to kill them. It was strange that the son of a farmer, accustomed from an early age to the necessities of slaughtering animals, should be so squeamish. Stranger still that a former soldier schooled in the accoutrements of death, from small arms to switchblades, would be incapable of cutting a pig's throat. Irrationally, he had developed affection for the creatures, born out of respect for their intelligence. There was no question of going to Abu Zatar. His uncle would not have understood. Hussein wondered whom he could safely approach with his problem. Then he hit upon the idea of asking the head of the family who rented his father's mud brick house. Hussein had overridden strenuous objections from Layla when he originally leased the building to one of the oldest Palestinian refugee families who had arrived in the town during Al-Jid's lifetime. His wife could not understand why he charged so little rent, or why, when there was a surplus at the butcher's shop, he took gifts of meat to his tenants. It was more than welfare relief on Hussein's part. By using his father's house to benefit the less fortunate, he hoped to atone for selling off Al-Jid's beloved land. Whatever the reason, the family was grateful for his kindness, and the husband, a man about 60, was more than willing to care for the pigs and get one of his sons to slaughter them for a small remuneration. In this way, Hussein took on his first employees, and Ahmed proved to be a capable worker. 9 months and 100 piglets later, there was more to do than ever before. The retail side of the business was growing, and it looked as though Abu Zatar's prediction of easy wealth had not been unfounded. There remained, however, one apparently insurmountable problem. Hussein scrupulously examined each new litter. He measured each piglet's weight and size, inspected hooves and tails, and checked eyes, looking for signs. So far, he had been lucky, but he knew that his chances of producing another generation without some evidence of inbreeding were very slight. As Layla put it, who would want to eat a 2-headed beast with 6 legs? The gold mine would have closed prematurely, if not for Abu Zatar's intervention. The wily Emporium proprietor had already made numerous contributions. He provided, at only a fraction above cost, feed, antibiotics, a large and rather noisy freezer, and even an electric prod that Hussein didn't have the heart to use. But the solution he devised totally eclipsed his previous efforts. Through his cross-border contacts, Abu Zatar managed to discover a supply of frozen boar semen. Hussein had not been too keen on the idea. There was something unnatural about it that made him feel queasy. When the first consignment arrived aboard a Damascus-bound truck, Hussein's misgivings multiplied. Both the label on the box, which contained the vials of sperm, and the instruction booklet that accompanied it were written in Hebrew. Although there was also a religious prohibition of pork on the other side of the river, it was marketed as a basar lavon, white meat. At first, pork was sold secretly in butcher shop, but when 800,000 Russian immigrants arrived in Israel after 1989, pork was practically on every street corner. To many in Hussein's town, the very idea of artificial insemination was outrageous enough, but Hussein knew that if the origin of his latest secret were to become public knowledge, then everything he had worked for would go up in smoke. Abu Zatar was, of course, thrilled by the prospect of such technological innovation. With his good eye and magnifying glass, he studied the thermometer and other equipment with giddy enthusiasm. Poring over the instructions, he displayed a knowledge of Hebrew that shocked Hussein. As Abu Zatar assembled the catheter, he airily explained that when no one in the wider Middle East was allowed to say the word Israel in public without being arrested, he wanted to learn the country's language as an act of youthful rebellion. His dream was realized after peace was made between Jordan and Israel in 1994, and cheap Hebrew correspondent courses became available from the Knesset. Then he brushed aside his nephew's fears once and for all by declaring, "What's good for pigs is good for politics." Bolstered by his uncle's confidence, Hussein reluctantly agreed to give the procedure a try. They restricted themselves to working on the big pig until the method was perfected. The first 2 attempts were not successful, but by carefully monitoring the signs of certain redness around the genitals in the presence of one of the boars, a rise in body temperature, Hussein was able to choose the opportune time for the 3rd attempt. The resulting litter was small, 8 piglets, but it was clear that the benefits of introducing new blood far outweighed a temporary slowdown. As the litters grew in number and frequency, it was Ahmed who christened Abu Zatar's pig. When he groomed her, he whispered to al-Khanazir, mother of all pigs, how she alone had brought them good fortune. In any event, there had been a period during the early days when production outpaced demand. This troubled Abu Zatar, who hated to see waste, particularly if there was a way of turning it into profit. The freezer he supplied was not large enough to contain the surplus, and the fuel costs of running the generator proved to be unnervingly high, so the old man urged his nephew to find some other way of preserving the meat. Hussein started visiting a culinary website at the town's relatively new internet cafe and found one that detailed various methods of producing ham. He arrived at the farm with 2 aluminum pots to ensure against trichinosis, an incomprehensible but nevertheless unpleasant-sounding condition. The meat had to be treated at high temperatures. Hussein was by no means confident in the small fire Ahmed had built, so he compensated by insisting that the meat be steeped in a brine solution and then subjected to several prolonged applications of salt, sugar, potassium nitrate, pepper, and spices, all of which were supplied from the emporium. The result then was dried in the sun. These hams were hard and waxy. Abu Zatar was not persuaded. Next, Hussein scoured the internet for smoking techniques. He left instructions for Ahmed to build a small hut out of corrugated iron while he set about finding the right fuel himself. One site called for oak and beech woods guaranteed to give the meat a golden hue, but not only were these particular species unavailable, Hussein lived in an area where it was hard to find any wood at all. So he sent Ahmed's sons to comb the countryside. The assortment of Sisyphus scrub they managed to collect gave the meat an unhealthy blue-gray tinge and made it smell rank and bitter. No wonder these bushes produced the thorns in Christ's crown, Hussein said, disgusted. He was prepared to give up the project altogether, but Abu Zatar urged him on. Through his infinite contacts, the old man learned of an olive grove in the occupied territories that was about to be destroyed to make way for a new settlement. He procured a truckload of olive wood and, at his own expense, arranged for it to be transported to the farm. Hussein protested about the political implications, but his uncle was unimpressed. "Surely Al-Jid told you the story about the sacred olive," his uncle explained. "Each leaf bears the words, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the beneficent, the merciful. If a tree does not pray 5 times a day, God forsakes it, and its fate is to be cut down. Is it my fault that the Israelis find every Palestinian olive grove impious?" Hussein let the gnarled branches weather outdoors to reduce the tannin in the bark and then carefully built a fire in his smokehouse. Alas, he was rewarded. The meat, everyone agreed, gave off an aroma of bitter olive, a rich, mellow flavor that became instantly popular with the customers. However, the consignments of wood arrived too infrequently for smoking to be economically viable. Apart from one man who provided his own juniper berries and twigs, he had a cousin who sent them from Germany, which enabled Hussein to produce a perfectly acceptable Westphalian ham. He was forced to go back to boiling his commercial product. After much trial and error, he hit upon a method of coating the cooked hams with honey, anise, and dried nana, mint. The real breakthrough came when he made a thick coating of Mother Fadma's za'atar spice mixture, and a very Arab ham was born. This required time and space and necessitated the construction of a processing house to keep the meat out of the sun and away from flies. Although Hussein scrupulously never tasted the meat himself, judging only from its density and feel, he was not satisfied with the texture of the boiled hams as he had been with the smoked variety. So he was pleased that Abu Zatar was able to arrange for most of the farm's processed meat output to be exported. Hussein made a point of never asking its destination. If frozen boar sperm and olive wood were easily smuggled across the river, there was no reason why a cargo of hams couldn't go the other way. He just didn't want to know. Anything that was not made into processed meat was taken to the sausage machine in the other part of the processing block. Even before the arrival of the machine, Abu Zatar insisted that any leftovers too unappetizing to sell be partially cooked, minced with stale bread, and stuffed into intestines. He reckoned that the sheer novelty would ensure sales, and he was right. It was a labor-intensive process by hand. Ahmed's sons helped out, but it was still too much work. Hussein complained to Abu Zatar, who responded by turning to his mysterious friend Hani, a former Palestinian fixer and purveyor of the improbable. He had managed to smuggle al-Khanazir across 4 hostile borders, the first of his magic tricks. The second was the unexpected delivery to the farm of an ancient German Wurstmeister. The sausage machine was a thing of Baroque beauty. Pipes, bowls, pistons, mixers, drums, shakers, grips, and paws exuded a futuristic, functional elegance. The power unit looked like it could drive an ocean liner, and when the machine was working, it rattled alarmingly, but it performed its task with flawless efficiency. Brain and brawn, ears and jowls, lungs and trimmings, and Hussein's failed hams were placed in a large hopper above the primary grinding assembly. Once ground, they were mixed into a moving bowl by a rotary knife blade and then transferred into an emulsifier, a large drum where bread, cooked grains, herbs, and spices could be added gradually from their own separate hoppers. When the mixture reached the required consistency, it was forced by a screw mechanism through a small opening into the casings. The skins were washed, scraped, and treated with hydrogen peroxide and vinegar in a different part of the machine. An automatic tying arm twisted the links into 2 sizes, breakfast or cocktail. The sausages were more popular than the hams. In fact, the only byproduct that met with outright consumer resistance was the blood pudding. It simply would not move until Ahmed came up with the novel idea of dyeing the casings turquoise, a color that traditionally warded off the evil eye. After that, it sold steadily. The processing building was a monument to Abu Zatar's cheerful dictum that there was a use for every part of the little piggy. Swept along by his uncle's enthusiasm and seduced by the money he was making, Hussein focused on the positive benefits and suppressed his apprehensions. The morning's incident outside the mosque caused all the old anxieties to resurface. He would have liked to think that it was an isolated occurrence, but it was clearly more serious than that. The trouble I find with reading from the novel is that people think that it's only about that, but the novel is an infinite space, and there are many other themes to the book. I'd like to, for the second excerpt, just to read about some of the women in the book. There are 3 generations of women living in the Sabas household. On the day of their father's funeral, Abu Zatar announced that henceforth Fadma was to be confined to the house. No family honor was worth protecting if women roamed freely in the wider world. Since there was no one to appeal to, she reluctantly complied. With everything she possibly needed in her brother's store, she effectively became his prisoner. Only Abu Zatar's business acquaintances were admitted to the house, and in time nobody in the village bothered to ask after her. When his wife belittled her, Fadma promised to do better. As the brunt of his children's jokes, she was the one who laughed the loudest. Once she overheard her brother discussing the purpose of women with a business associate. They were good for cooking and cleaning plus one other function, he said, lowering his voice. His remarks sent his companion into raucous howls of laughter. Fatma's self-esteem sank so low she wasn't sure whether she disagreed with him. She knew what to expect from him and his family. Her life was completely restricted, but at least she was cared for. In time, she yielded to what she perceived as unalterable fate. After Najla's death, the marriage proposal from Al-Jid upset the equilibrium, and it loomed like a precipice before her. After years of despondency, happiness was something that belonged to those who were never in the way. The prospect of the unfamiliar terrorized Fatma. There was no guarantee she would be treated well. Worst of all, she knew this was her last chance. If marriage proved to be a sham, she doubted whether she would survive. She tried to discuss her anxieties with her brother, who told her, "I've done my duty, you do yours." With each passing day, she became more agitated. Najla had given Al-Jid 6 healthy sons, one right after the other. Whenever Fatma glimpsed the brood from her hiding place behind the curtain in the store, her eyes filled with tears. She could never replace their dead mother, her beloved sister. Fatma sank deeper into depression. Even in marriage, all she could expect were morsels from someone else's table. Debilitated and listless, she moped around her brother's house. One day, a troupe of clowns in faded harlequin costumes invaded the village and advertised their one and only performance with the nasal whine of a zurna pipe. The whole village was entranced. Abu Zatar, who had never taken a day's vacation in his life, closed the store and rounded up his family. As they were leaving, his wife stopped Fatma from crossing the threshold and then locked the door without bothering to say goodbye. It was a kind of petty cruelty Fatma had grown accustomed to, but alone in the house it seemed to penetrate to the very core of her dilemma. In the past, she would have accepted her lot and climbed to the roof, where she worked among the dried herbs for Zatar. She had always taken solace in handling the leaves and flowers of the thyme plant, known to the ancient Greeks for stimulating inner strength and courage. However, not even a herbaceous recipe laced with the magic properties of hemp could heal such a troubled soul. She was afraid of leaving the life she knew, no matter how often she was mistreated. At the same time, the possibility of a better life, however faint, made her present situation unbearable. Her mind was a churning water wheel in motion. As soon as her brother and his family were out of sight, she adjusted her scarf and unceremoniously climbed out a back window. The path that confronted her led away from the village to an unbroken, undulating expanse of rock and sand. An inky blue-gray bruise of a sky pressed down onto the horizon. A storm was fast approaching. She didn't have the faintest idea where she was going, nor did she care. For the first time, she was totally alone in the world, responsible for herself. A torrential rain started lashing down. The imminent threat of a flash flooding quickened her pace. As she passed through a gap between some boulders, she almost ran into a black Beit al-Shahar, a Bedouin tent woven from animal hair. Unwilling to retrace her steps, but unsure of going forward, she stood beside a damp, smoldering campfire, soaked to the skin, cold and panting hard. Fatma knew the old stories. There were some places where you did not venture, some people who should never be approached. Certain women were powerful enough to curse life and turn it into barren solitude. Fatma didn't give much thought as to why she had not yet married, although her sister-in-law never stopped warning her against sleeping on the wrong side of the bed or in the light of a full moon. But Fatma understood ruggedness on a man's face translates differently on a woman, so she rejected superstition, preferring to believe that it was the will of God, which she had no choice but to obey. The storm was reaching its height. Each raindrop, the size and weight of a small stone, was a physical force that urged her forward. Cautiously peering inside the tent, Fatma adjusted to the gloom and saw a home much like those in the village, with cushions, water jugs, a trunk, and a rifle. She had heard rumors about the sisters of soothsayers who lived there. They did jobs nobody else dared to do, abortions, exorcisms, and seances. They could make the unseen visible, and they could change the present. Under their tutelage, an experienced girl bled like an athra, a virgin, on her wedding night, or a mature woman could be given a vagina as succulent as an overripened fig. To the sisters who lived completely outside society, Fatma was just another silly village girl, unable to distinguish good fortune from bad. Inside the tent, she expected someone to appear. When nobody did, she sat down and squinted into the dark corners before blurting out her innermost fears. I am to marry a man who I am told is good, but my sister, his first wife, is already in her grave. Shouldn't I stay where I am? Gathering a small heap of pebbles and bones on the rug beside her, she thoroughly examined each one, running her fingers over their pitted surfaces, feeling their weight and shape. Then in cupped hands, she shook them like dice and threw them. They fell clattering to the ground against the noise of the wind and the rain outside. From one angle, the pebbles and bones appeared to form a question mark. From another, a broken line of mountains in the shape of a heavily pregnant woman. It was not the answer Fatma expected, but it was the one she deserved. When she climbed out the window, the decision had been made. She would go because she wanted to and leave if it turned bad, an act that would result in the irrevocable dishonoring of her family and her own death for sure. At least she might get to experience a life that would be truly her own, and any power she exerted over it would be better than the existence forced upon her. Fatma marveled how things of the heart could be decided in a moment. Thank you.